they were all sort of preparing for this, saying this is an eventuality. And when it occurs, we need to move swiftly so that we can maintain our power. It was about power maintenance. It was never about, like, oh my goodness, it's so weird. They're all turning on Biden simultaneously. Not weird at all. If you think that the whole point is to maintain the integrity of Democrat power. Like, just, that was the game. So they had to replace Biden to do that.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Vince Coglianese, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Bradley, great to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. So, thus far, we've talked to Senator Ron Johnson, we've talked to Senator Rick Scott, and we've talked to the new House Freedom Caucus Chairman, Andy Harris.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about not only what the right needs to do to win come November, but what conservatives need to do to win in those important fights right after the election, whether that's the Senate leadership fight or the speaker fight, if there is one, and the fight over House rules, and how Johnson's going to work with Andy Harris and the Freedom Caucus. But every single time I have this conversation, everyone brings up, well, the media. The media has a massive, massive influence. You are a man of the media.
Yeah.
And I think everyone has identified it here on the show. I think it's important to talk about the media, whether the media is a function of the Democratic Party, whether it is its own separate entity that pushes establishment or uniparty lines, what kind of impact it's going to have on the election. So tell the people what you currently do and how you got into media in the first place.
So actually, I wound my way through the Heritage Foundation at one point. In 2010, I was an intern for communications at the Heritage Foundation. But prior to that, I was in radio in Eastern North Carolina, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life there, working for a couple years after college. I was also in a local newspaper there. I worked for a great guy called Lockwood Phillips, who owned both the radio station and the local newspaper. And then from there, came to D.C., did a brief tour at Heritage, and then went to the Daily Caller. And I've been there ever since, 14 years, and rose to editor-in-chief at one point of that publication. And then in the process, went back to radio here in Washington at WMAL here in D.C. So I host an afternoon radio show where I cover all of this. And I talk to the very guys that you're talking about with some frequency. I love talking to all three of them, actually. And you're right about the role that the media plays. It certainly exerts a lot of power, and it's on behalf, usually and specifically, of the Democrat Party, but broadly of establishment interests in D.C. And that's for a lot of reasons. Some of it is like just this is the culture that a lot of the legacy media people grew up in. All of their friends are like this. Who could have a different worldview? We all violently agree on these subjects. So some of that is just it's herd instinct, right? It's not. There's oftentimes on the right this belief that there's like a talking points memo that goes out, and then the media is all repeating it at the same time. There is some of that. That's definitely true. I mean, they're receiving messages from various campaign operatives. We're really focused on this. This is really important. I can't believe no one's calling out Trump for this. And then the media will ape those talking points. But a lot of it is just instinct. They know, does this help Democrats? Does this hurt Democrats? Should I talk about it at all? Should I emphasize it like crazy? That happens quite a bit. And I think when it comes to politicians, first of all, like a lot of them are just like totally obsessed with seeing their own names in headlines. And they like seeing their names in headlines, not just anywhere, not just any random blog, but in prestigious places. So they're kind of intoxicated by the idea that they could be the one to have their name featured in the New York Times. And even better, maybe I could change the mind of this New York Times reporter. I'll be the one to finally break him. And if there's anybody who's a good example of this, who everybody knows, it's Donald Trump in some ways, because President Trump has long had an affection for the New York Times. It's kind of an abusive relationship, actually, because he comes from New York City. He grows up in this environment. He sees everybody in his whole life always turn to the New York Times as the paper of record. And he has a tremendous amount of desire to be beloved by that very same paper from his hometown. There's some nostalgia wrapped up in that, which is why he's on the phone with Maggie Haberman still to this day, all the time, talking to her, giving her updates on what's going on, this New York Times reporter. And for those of us on the right who look at this in media, it drives us crazy. Because what we're saying, in part, is help us build a new environment, a new ecosystem, one where information can actually be delivered, one where you will get a fair shake, one where the people who actually are, say, voting for you are reading the content. That's where you should be. And that message, I think, can't be delivered often enough. It should never, though, be an excuse for the right to become lazy in its pursuit of journalism, which is just sort of like a grumpy anger that, oh, how come they didn't give that to us? And just constantly bitter about it. Well, how hard did you work for it? I mean, how aggressively were you reading up on the subject before you started asking the questions? How much do you know about this? Also, one other thing, and I know I'm a radio show host, so I talk forever, so I interrupt at any point. But one other thing that I've learned about Capitol Hill in particular with media is that there's a presence bias. So if you're in Capitol Hill, if you're a reporter who's actually in there every day, knocking on doors, seeing members of Congress, talking to them all the time, constantly working their staffers, just being present increases the likeliness that you're the place that these lawmakers are going to go and are going to talk to and give their scoops and talk about important issues and break past the legacy media. So it's a complicated, dynamic environment, but you're right. The media it exerts a lot of influence. And I'll say one last thing, a note of optimism on this subject. People are actually turning away from a lot of legacy media. News consumers are, for sure. The ruling class is still clinging to it in a lot of ways, which is why this phenomenon occurs. But generally, the broad electorate is turning away from it. There was a poll that was just put out recently on the Sun Belt. And it was a political poll. It was based on, Trump was doing really well in the Sun Belt and in all the states, all the way from east to west. That's where the Sun Belt is. And they talked about media consumption habits. And the number one place that people get their news from, out of all of the people who were surveyed, social media.
Yeah.
It's not legacy news outlets. In fact, to the extent that traditional news outlets are even measured, Newsmax now sits at the same exact spot as MSNBC in terms of media consumption, in terms of their number. That's their first news source. So, which is a really great story for Newsmax. And it really starts to give you a picture of what's happening, which is that people are trying to break free in their news consumption, in their knowledge consumption from all these legacy news outlets. And lawmakers, the ruling class, would do well to pay heed to where people are actually getting their news.
In the advertisement that Tucker Carlson released when he announced his new venture, he says, the media told you X and Y and Z. And then there's this awesome tight shot of Tucker, and he says, and it killed them. What killed the legacy media over the past 8 years? It seems like you cannot separate the death of legacy media in some ways to Donald Trump. But is it technology? Is it the politics? Is it peeling back the curtain, taking off the mask and seeing these people for who they actually are? Like, what's causing this collapse?
Well, distrust in institutions are skyrocketing at all levels. And so the more established you are, there's going to be, I think, an innate distrust in what you do. That's true, I think, of all major institutions in the United States, because people look around and they say things are not going well. And despite all of the media lies, and every time they do lie, they're devaluing their currency, obviously. And that leads people away from them. So when the press keeps telling you in this era that the economy is better than ever, you're doing great. Don Lemon straight up saying, after he got fired by CNN, which was a miracle, but he goes out and he confronts somebody on the street, and the guy's like, yeah, I'm doing worse than I was 4 years ago. He's like, actually, that's not true. He fact checks the guy about his own finances on the street.
Yeah.
And which was hilarious. But it is indicative of sort of the media hive mind on this subject, which is that's impossible. I'm sitting in a brightly lit studio. The air conditioning is set exactly to the temperature that I prefer. I was driven here by a car service this morning. All my meals are wonderful, in fact. And everybody I talk to is super happy and rich. What? How could the economy be bad? The government says it's great. So this is obviously, once again, the stupid, unwashed masses who are ingesting lies. This is what they're thinking. They're ingesting lies, and then they're responding by saying, actually, things are bad. And they're not. They're being lied to, and because they're dumb, they're believing it. And that's not actually how people arrive at those conclusions. The electorate is there because they have a material sense of their own lives, right? The most effective messages in all of politics are always based on, the things that affect you directly.
Right.
You know, whether or not you'll have a job, how much you're making in terms of your money, how much you have to give away to the government. That's where people get the most activated and animated. What's happening to their kids directly. The national debt can be like an esoteric subject to a lot of people, although nowadays it's a very direct impact.
Right.
But specifically in your household, it matters. So when the media keeps telling us you're actually doing great, and when the numbers show us, actually, no, they're not. Everyone's poorer than they were when Biden became president. That's true on average across the country. Their money's not going quite as far. And credit card debt has never been at a higher level ever. We're at record levels. Credit card defaults are skyrocketing. More Americans are living paycheck to paycheck now. To the extent that anyone gets jobs, the jobs numbers are always like completely ridiculous because like, oh, unemployment is so low. Well, there's a lot of reasons for this. E.J. Antoni, who is an amazing economist and happens to be my first cousin, he talks about this all the time, which is that, wait a second, actually, people are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and that's artificially deflating the unemployment numbers. And simultaneously, all the real job gains are happening for foreign nationals. American citizens are losing jobs in the United States. And if you had a media who gave a crap about Americans, they would talk about these things. But they don't. They ignore that. And so the idea that you would sit around and be like, what happened to, why don't people trust us? Like, why don't they trust? It's because you lie all the time. You lied about Russiagate. You lied about the Steele dossier. You lied about the Hunter Biden laptop. You were actively engaged in a cover-up on that subject. The Duke lacrosse rape scandal was a lie. I mean, how many, you can go down the list and it's always one more thing, another lie. The Jeffrey Epstein stuff. You have ABC's Amy Robach was sitting on a hot microphone with a camera. I think it was James O'Keefe who put this video out. And on that video, she's saying, I had this whole story. I had the whole story. But they wouldn't let me release it. It was about Prince Andrew.
Right.
They wouldn't let me release it because they wanted an interview with William and Kate, meaning ABC, the network. So they killed my excellent reporting. And now I'm watching as the Miami Herald is breaking it years down the road. And I had the whole thing, she says. And that's, so when all this happens, you're like, why should I trust any of these people?
Do you think it's, and you laid out some of the media's mentality, and I think it's right to say it's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's more like you see a flock of geese flying in that V formation.
Yeah.
And the lead goose goes this way.
Yes.
And the rest follow. And I think it operates a little bit more like that. My question is, are they lying on behalf of their own interests? Are they lying on behalf of the interests of the Democratic Party in particular? I mean, this is where I think actually this election cycle has revealed a lot about the relationship between the legacy media and the Democratic Party. Because it was lockstep until about the first presidential debate, if you remember that one between Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like there was a gap. But was that perpetrated by the left and by the Democratic Party? Right? Does John King come on CNN right after the debate and say, ooh, I think Biden needs to step down because it's his own thought? Or is it coming from somewhere else?
You noticed it wasn't just CNN, though. It was also MSNBC. Mm-hmm. They all did it simultaneously. And now, I read a couple things into that. One, it would be a mistake to say this was an inconsistency in their presentation. I think it's a consistency which is that they represent Democrat establishment interests primarily. Broadly, by the way, I don't want to leave Republicans out of this because there are Republican establishment interests really that are merged. This is where people use the phrase Uniparty, and those interests are very much represented by the media. Whether it's, forcing people to get any jab from the government, my body, my choice, except for like if they're going to inject you with new medicine, or like sending money to Ukraine. There's no question that there's a lot of bipartisan crossover on that subject.
Yeah, the Uniparty that we say on the show, it is the party in government that works on behalf of itself and its friends.
Yeah, and it's
the clearest way to explain it.
And some of it is typified by exemplified by like Kamala Harris is being endorsed by the Cheneys. It's like there's an obvious reason for this. Like that comes from that impulse. And so the election comes down to fundamentally the establishment versus a guy who cares about sovereignty and wants to represent American interests. And so if he's the opposite of what the establishment wants, they're not representing American interests. So I think to answer your question on, what the media is up to, one, during that Biden debate, there's a reason they scheduled it in June. It was meant to happen early. It had to. Whoever was around Biden didn't pick his own debate schedule. Somebody picked the debate schedule for him and said, if we're going to do this, we need to make sure we have one early. And the earliness of it was meant to test his competency on national television. It was meant to be, look, we don't want to do this in October. We don't want that debate to occur in October. If it's going to happen at all, it's got to happen early so that we can change course. It was a strategic decision to put him that early. So they did. And when he met one of the expectations, which is perhaps he'll fail miserably, which he did, everybody inside those newsrooms has friends in the White House, in the campaign, in that world. They're constantly chattering with them, trying to divine wisdom and information out of them, strategy, what are you up to, what are you thinking? And just that you could even tell on TV, they were saying, I'm getting text messages from Democrats who were saying this was bad. That's because they were all sort of preparing for this, saying this is an eventuality. And when it occurs, we need to move swiftly so that we can maintain our power. It was about power maintenance. It was never about like, oh my goodness, it's so weird. They're all turning on Biden simultaneously. Not weird at all. If you think that the whole point is to maintain the integrity of Democrat power, like just that was the game. So they had to replace Biden to do that.
Well, and it has a lot of profound implications for the type of regime that we live in, because if that is power maintenance going against the sitting president of the United States,
right,
that means that President Biden doesn't run the country.
Exactly right. Exactly
so
right.
Who does?
Well, there's a first of all,
who are these? Like we talk about the establishment all the time, and we talk about how it operates more organically than people would like to think. Like it's actually George Soros has a lot of problems with making sure that progressive DAs win, and then they decriminalize everything and they destroy your neighborhood.
Sure,
absolutely true.
Yeah.
But it is not George Soros pulling the strings via Alex necessarily on every decision that's made in the Democratic Party.
It's a convergent of all of the various wealthy interests who have captured the agencies of our government. That's really what it is. And so what's happened is, rather than exist in what should be a free market, in many ways we have a very captured market where we have a bunch of really powerful companies, defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, major tech companies, who have figured out that for their long-term well-being, they just have to get the government to regulate away all of their competitors, need to lock in their products, need to establish litigation immunity for all of their offerings. They need to constantly be on the dole to collect more and more cash. That's what's happening. I mean, that's what. So the end result is, like I remember you mentioned Tucker earlier. One of the great segments he did on his Fox News show was he, for a bunch of reasons, including it's so subversive to even do it on cable television, was he did a supercut of all of the various media outlets who aired Pfizer ads right next to their COVID segments. They would talk about COVID and this brought to you by Pfizer. This segment brought to you by Pfizer. This segment brought to you by Pfizer. So I can tell you, working in a corporate media environment, and thank God I have such a great, I work for a great radio station, a great radio company, and they don't interfere with the on-air product at all. They don't tell me what to say. They let me be free to say what I want. But you can see how at a television network where these guys and the fight to get the jobs that these guys undertake, the backstabbing they undertake to, like, in TV, if you work at CNN or MSNBC or even Fox, but especially at those two that I can think of, because I've met a lot of people at Fox. I like them, very nice people. But the reality is, like, in order for someone to get a job, someone else needs to be fired. Someone's life has to be made miserable in order for your life to improve. That's the unfortunate reality of, only a limited number of hours in a day and only a very few small number of primetime television shows to be competing for. That's what happens. So it's a cutthroat world. And so when people get there, one of the things that they're thinking is, well, how do I preserve myself? How do I keep this? How do I keep doing it forever? Well, one of the ways is don't piss your boss off. How would you piss your boss off? You attack the revenue streams of your company. So no, okay, so Pfizer's fine. We'll leave Pfizer out of this. We'll leave Lockheed out of this. We'll you just go down the list. So that's on the media side. On the government side, these companies have captured too many of our agencies. When Purdue Pharma has the keys to the FDA, and then they can get the FDA to sign off on OxyContin without a warning that it's addictive, that's how you start the opioid crisis, for sure. That's how you lead to the deaths of millions of Americans. But at the same time, that's also how you enrich Purdue Pharma. Mm-hmm. And you have systems in our government that are designed to protect that. Hell, with defense contracting, I think I'm sure but I think a lot of people don't realize you realize how things are built for the military in the United States of America? Like what the actual process is for building stuff? These defense contractors will build component part manufacturing plants in every congressional district in the country. So the plane that you see flying in combat, it's cool. That's great. I love that it's American made. I think we need a really strong military, and I want really talented defense contractors to provide those goods. But do you understand how corrupt the scheme is? Like they do manufacturing in almost every congressional district they can possibly get their hands on in order to protect the gravy train, not to optimize the product, but to make sure that Congress never, ever turns against them. No, like, oh my God, I can't destroy jobs in my district. I can't let that happen. So we got to keep the gravy train flowing. So
there's a fascinating clip of Kevin McCarthy when he was Speaker of the House receiving people in the Capitol.
Yeah.
And these two women come up. I believe they come up and they're from Ohio, if I remember correctly. And they say, "Hi, Speaker McCarthy, we're from so-and-so, Ohio." And Speaker McCarthy goes, "Oh, so you're represented by blank Republican.
Yeah.
And in your hometown, that's where we make our tanks." And these people were so happy to hear that. And it's a true, genuine moment. Like, oh, the Speaker of the House.
Also, it's a sign. McCarthy has a really acute understanding of electoral politics,
Totally.
more so than almost any politician. He's very incisive on that subject. Like he knows down to every congressional district and exactly what you're saying. He knows their financial interests. He's got it, and that is, to his credit, a real talent.
It's a real talent, but it also is no mistake that he remembered that the tanks are made there.
Yeah.
Or a part of the tank.
Yeah.
Right? And you're totally right. It's this racket where, okay, well, if we can't overtly buy politicians in government, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to make the representative reliant on our company being in their district in order to get what we want in legislation.
Yeah.
The only person to really buck that I've seen is Representative Matt Gaetz, who has a massive amount of military jobs, of defense contractor jobs in his district, and has advocated for being on various committees, such as the House Foreign Affairs Committee, down the list.
Yeah.
But he's the only one to really buck that and say, like, no, actually, I don't think we should have troops in Syria anymore. Actually, I think the AUMF needs to end.
Right.
And way too many Republicans, when you actually see, my buddy from college, he had this great thing, and he said, it's really nice that everyone wears suits, but I think we should all change our representatives' dress code to wearing racing driver suits. And they need to put on patches for all of their sponsors.
Yes.
And that would be really, really revealing, because it's not just the money that flows into the campaign apparatuses. It's the money that is generated in those local economies that sometimes make these representatives beholden to those interests. And so when you talk about how a uniparty is formed over time, it's you have large corporate interests. You have leadership that's been there for a long time that knows these corporate interests well.
Right.
And those two coordinate. They offer little carrots and really big sticks to new representatives who come into Congress, say, I want to shake things up.
Yeah.
Well, don't you know, Mitch McConnell, and, don't you know that the tanks are made in your district? It would be a real shame if,
Yeah, exactly.
if all of a sudden I didn't provide you any fundraising for your next race. Wouldn't that be a shame? That's kind of the stick that's threatened.
That impression's a little fast. I got to
slow it down
dramatically.
I need to freeze. Well, we got to fill air. It would help fill airtime, right? If I just froze for a few minutes, we wouldn't have to talk so much. But that is how the sausage gets made in Washington, and it's disgusting. And you know this because you talk to all of these people on a regular basis.
I just think that, I don't hold it against you for trying to represent the businesses who occupy your district. That's fine. That's a good bias to have. But at some point, you have to recognize when we get to an untenable level, when you're like, wow, one of the things I constantly think of, that just in all of these political conversations, is Thomas Sowell has an expression, which is that there are no policy solutions, there are only trade-offs, which is, I think, an important and dynamic way to think about all these subjects. You're never going to have the perfect solution to this. Look at federal employees right now. Like, there was a time in American history where all of the federal jobs were rewarded on the basis of political affiliation. You'd have ex-cons in the street hustling up votes, and then they get jobs at the Postal Service after it's over. It's like that's the way it used to be. So we had something in America called civil service reform, where we just went in the complete opposite direction. We're like, no, you can stay at the federal government forever, and nobody can fire you, and no party's going to replace you, and we're going to get rid of all of this patronage. Well, now the opposite problem has happened. Now we have a deeply corrupt and in many cases deadbeat government workforce, which desperately needs to be cleaned out. So there's never going to be the ideal solution is always going to be sort of an approximation of the middle of those things. But this has gone too far. I mean, whether it's sort of the corruption in our health system, whether it's like how unhealthy the United States is, unhealthy because the federal government has aided and abetted the advancement of chronic disease rather than actual health. Whether it's, dumping money into all these military boondoggles that aren't really meant to enhance our national security, but instead to enrich defense contractors at the expense of American lives. It's just, at some point you have to slam on the brakes and say, well, wait a second. The left loves to use this phrase like, oh, we're progressive. Well, what are you progressing towards? Like, right. If you veer off the road, will you just keep driving straight through the woods? Like, no, you have to, back up for a second and reorient yourself and get back on course.
What do you make of Maha? What do you make of Make America Healthy Again?
I love it.
Yeah?
I love it. And I love it for a reason that I don't hear talked about enough. First of all, I think that America should rediscover its health. It's embarrassing to watch old footage of the country. Like, everybody was skinny, in great shape. It was actually outdoors, playing games, having and looked way happier than we do now. Way happier than we do now. Also, like a lot of people, I've gone in fits and starts with exercise and eating well in my life. And I realize every time I am on a good, sustaining good habits, I spiritually feel better. I feel better about my work. I feel better about my family life. I feel more balanced. I'm less erratic. That's all good on an individual level. But here's the one that I think not enough people are talking about, which I'd love. I know some are, which is there's always these debates how do we get control of the federal budget, right? That's been the thing forever. It's oh crap, we're in debt. And yeah, we're in debt. We're $35 trillion in debt. And you think the cost of eggs exploding now is bad? Just wait. This whole thing's coming down. And almost nobody is prepared for it. But one of the ways you tackle it is the area that you're not supposed to talk about in Washington, which is entitlements. Entitlement spending is forbidden to be discussed, even though it's the single biggest, combined it's the single biggest thing we spend money on. And so much of that is health. So much of that is disease maintenance.
We're subsidizing Coca-Cola and Kellogg to poison your kids.
So much of that is just hey, your obesity is totally fine. We're just going to give you these really expensive drugs paid for by taxpayers to maintain it forever. You're wait a second. So I just want to give immense credit to Casey and Callie Means for making this a big deal, because they have Dr. Casey Means is a Stanford-educated ear, nose, and throat doctor who basically cut bait from her very successful career because she realized that medicine wasn't helping people, it was just maintaining their misery. And instead, we need to go back to the basics of how can we make people healthy? And she detected, thanks to her lobbyist brother, Callie Means, that there's an immense amount of corruption in D.C. that's actually enabling this, from our foods poisoning us because they are trying to, basically the food industry wants cheap and addictive ingredients in the food in order to sustain their profits. So that needs to be—
It's just like Purdue Pharma.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, in its own way. And so you need to just tackle that. That's obviously true. But, sorry, this is a long-winded way of saying this. You want to get control of health spending, decrease the need for it.
Right.
So if we had Americans who were healthy, broadly healthy, instead of absurdly obese, which is actually what, unfortunately, most of the country is now, then we wouldn't have to spend so much money on end-of-life care and disease maintenance and all of these things that are this immense expenditure on the federal budget. And it doesn't involve cutting anybody's benefits. This is an area— it's not it's always Washington pretends the only options are increase your taxes or cut spending. They pretend those are the only two options. Those are not the only two options. There's another option, which is stop sucking up to your crony, corrupt donors and backers, and instead encourage health again. Like, go back to like JFK's vision of what this is supposed to be, which is that like we have a fitness test, we encourage it in schools, we get kids to be healthy, we get them out there working out. I mean, JFK has this amazing quote where he talks about like one of the most unfortunate things are the chubby little fat kids who show up on the weekends to watch somebody else play basketball and count that as their week's exercise. He goes, that's one of the worst things he can envision, you know? And it's unfortunate because there's a pride certainly in getting healthy. And also, I just think it'll make the country better at every level. There's very few things that are kind of like a panacea. That's one of them. Drilling for oil and making America more healthy, those things will make us into a never-before-seen thriving country.
Yeah, and if for those of you who don't know what Vince is talking about with JFK's initiative to make America healthy again back in the 60s,
yes,
go look up the workout and do it. It'll kick your butt. And he thought that should be something that every 16-year-old kid in the United States should be able to do.
Yes,
is that workout, and it's wild to think how far we've fallen away from that.
Yeah.
And Maha, comes with RFK Jr.
Yeah,
and you kind of see this. A lot of memes on Twitter where I'm creating a team and it's Tulsi and it's RFK and it's Elon and Tucker and Trump and Vance and all these people kind of coalescing behind the former president's bid.
Yes. A genuinely diverse group of people.
Why is that?
Because they're all opposed to the current status quo. They're all opposed to the downward trajectory of the country. They're desperate to rescue it. There are going to be major issues on which they don't agree, like abortion, for instance. I'm certain that coalition that you just described doesn't all agree. They don't have the same feelings on that subject. It's a big subject. But they're so worried about the American project coming to an end by virtue of the direction we're hurtling that they've all decided to join forces. And they're all people who like very clearly have had evolutions throughout their political careers about the way they think about things. They're like honest thinkers who they may be wrong at this very moment about something, but they've really been thinking about it for a long time with a lot of intention for the actual betterment of the country. I mean, everyone keeps talking about like, oh, Trump's got all these former Democrats endorsing him. Trump himself is a former Democrat. Trump was a lifelong Democrat, and then he came to Republican politics. He always had these views, especially about trade, that he expressed throughout decades. But these are people who have put sincere thought into this subject. And also, importantly, they have a lot of proximity to the ruling class, all of the people you just described. So they're more intimately familiar with how these systems work, what the incentives are, and how we got here. That's what you need. That's what you need. Like RFK, his whole life has been in that class.
He's a Kennedy for crying out loud, right?
He's a Kennedy for sure. And, Tucker Carlson grew up in that and has been a part of it his whole life. He's always known really rich, successful people who have a lot of influence. And he doesn't pretend to be anything else. That's the other part. None of them are pretending to be somebody they're not. Donald Trump doesn't pretend to be someone he's not. He never, rolls up his sleeves and pretends that he normally swings a hammer at some campaign event. He always shows up in a full suit and a tie, and the only time you see him out of that uniform is when he's golfing. Like that's it. And the reason for that is because it's not a pose. He's just authentically being who he is, which is why people respect him. They realize he's not faking it, And so as a result, you have authentic people with real world experience who have made good faith efforts to improve their understanding of what's happened, and they're from the ruling class by and large. That's the kind of team I want on my side.
So these are traitors to the ruling class, all of whom, in their own way, have been mistreated by the media for a very long time.
Or recently.
Once
it becomes clear that they don't serve the establishment's interests, they're turned on. Ben Carson's a great example of this. Ben Carson was, up until he announced for Republican politics, one of the most heralded brain surgeons in American history. I was taught about Ben Carson in school.
Who's like the least offensive person in the history of American politics.
He was a revolutionary pediatric neurosurgeon, a black man who came up from poverty into out-of-control success. Just amazing. Just an amazing story. And as a result, the the way he was treated at first by the media was to use him as an expression of Black excellence, to talk about just his amazing achievements as an American. Like I said, I read about him in school. He had a book called Gifted Hands, where you read about his story and how he was able to fine tune or advance, I forget the specifics, but the hemispherectomy and which is they could literally remove half your brain and restore brain function to the other side. That's amazing. Or separating the Siamese twins conjoined at the head. Amazing things. The New York Times thought he was the greatest thing ever. They made a movie about him featuring Cuba Gooding Jr. as Dr. Carson, and then he decided to run for politics. And what happened to him? Yeah. He's the dumbest man alive. He left a sponge in someone's brain. He's an idiot. He was a terrible surgeon. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a crazy Christian. What a weird right-winger. The attacks on him were 180 degrees apart from the praise he was just receiving a year prior. And that's about the fact that he was a traitor to that ruling class, that he turned against them.
Is it more about their beliefs or more about being a traitor?
That they get – no, it's the accuracy with which they strike. That's the issue. You are always most annoyed by the person who criticizes you in the way that you know in your heart is true. You know, if you ever do one of these like internet things like we're doing now, like you're recording it, and then somebody calls out some physical thing on your body, they're like, hey, blah, 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 that looks like that or whatever. And you're like, damn it, he's right. Like you get angry, you're like, damn it.
Yeah.
And you're like, screw that guy. You're mad that they accurately, like if they make up some ridiculous allegation about you, you're like, whatever, I don't care. Like, that's so stupid. I know that's not true. It's like, there's no way. Like, I'm married. They'll be like, you'll never find a woman with an attitude like that. And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm married. I don't give a crap about what you're saying online. You know, but it's always the things that are true, the criticisms that are true, that annoy you the most. Mm-hmm. And I think all of these people you just referenced are attacking with precision. These are precision strikes. And it is infuriating the ruling class that knows they're right. And last thing on this topic of a ruling class, I think people hear it and they're like, why do we need a ruling class? Like, you don't need one. I don't need one. I'm an American. I'm free. You're totally right. You are an American. You're totally free. But in all structures that have ever existed, in nature, all of them, Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. It's just kind of a natural pecking order in terms of like where people settle in. Some people are more interested, more engaged on certain subjects. And you're always going to have a ruling class. You always will. No matter what system you try and devise, whether it's a totalitarian system or a free system, what should be a very free system like ours, you'll have a ruling class. What you need is a ruling class who cares. You need one that genuinely acknowledges, first of all, where their power comes from, which is the people, and then sees to it that they serve those interests. And what we have right now is the opposite of that. We have a ruling class that resents the fact that the people have a role and are only serving their own interests, which is why the entire Democrat Party project right now seems to be, how do we limit democracy as much as possible? How do we limit the role of the voters? How do we remove our opponents from the political ballot? How do we imprison our political opponents? How do we make it seem like their views are so toxic that you're not allowed to hold them in public? How do we censor the people who disagree with us so that those voices can't influence anybody else? And I think we're like 5 minutes from them straight up saying, how do we stop people from registering to vote? Like, we're that close. I'm serious.
It's dark, but it's...
Because if you look at the surveys right now on that subject, do you know that among Americans who are not registered to vote but are eligible, they wildly support Trump? Wildly. All of the available data shows this, which is why, have you noticed this election, there hasn't been a lot of register to vote push from the left? They know it too.
Where's Stacey Abrams? Running around, you know?
Yeah, no, they
haven't trotted her out.
She's hidden
yet.
somewhere right now.
She's hidden somewhere.
Yeah.
She's actually in the governor's mansion in Georgia. Sorry, Stacey,
Yes,
I forgot. I want to go back to this striking with precision that this motley crew of MAGA has that you were just discussing. First, I want to explain how I kind of view the last 8 years of American media. Trump comes down the golden escalator. He gets millions of dollars worth of free press from the media.
Right.
Because the media are like, this is a crazy story that is awesome.
It's the best.
For ratings.
It's the best.
It was opium for them.
And it was politically consistent too.
And it was politically consistent. And Trump is saying things that no one dared say this century in American politics. The wars, mistake. NAFTA, mistake. Immigration, mistake. All of the sacred cows for the Uniparty. He just attacked them relentlessly.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they cover him so much, right? It was almost like the news cycle wasn't focused on him, and then there would be a tweet about like him attacking the Pope or something like that, right? And then all of a sudden, they go, oh, we got to change segment B to Trump attacking the Pope now. And it gave him so much visibility with an American population who were so sick of those exact issues that he was talking about that he wins in 16.
Yes.
Oh, crap.
And let me just pause and add just one footnote to that, which is the reason they really liked emphasizing it. There was twofold. One was ratings, but the other was they thought it was such a cartoonish attempt to become president that there was no chance that people would actually support him. And in fact, by making him more present in the mind of the American people, it would dissuade them from ever supporting Republicans broadly again, because their thought was that, Trump he's such an awful person to our sensibilities. He must be awful to everybody else. We'll cover him, and we'll be able to successfully slander Republicans. They're all like that guy. They're all awful. And then Republicans lose power. So it was entirely consistent. It's why they were constantly like harping on they loved featuring him, and they were convinced there was no way he's going to win. There's no way. There's like, this is hilarious. He's not going to win. Remember when Ann Coulter was sitting on Bill Maher's show?
Donald Trump, and everyone laughs.
Yeah, and it was like, who do you think's going to win the election? And she's like, Donald Trump. The whole room laughed at her. The whole table of experts, the crowd laughed at her, and she just sat there and she took the laughs. She just sat there and absorbed them, and she was right.
No, all-time thug moment from Ann Coulter on Bill Maher. It was awesome to watch that in real time.
But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. But I just think that the reason for that was the ratings, and because they were convinced there's no chance this guy wins.
Yeah, so then they have to work in overdrive to try to delegitimize, one, Trump's presidency, two, their culpability in him becoming president of the United States, right? Okay, so somewhat we made this mess, now we got to fix it. And we will work with Uniparty elements to try to hamper him at every single turn, right? That was the craziest first 100 days that I can remember in my lifetime. Like, every single executive order was scrutinized, was torn apart, was publicized to the point where it would encourage some liberal activist judge to strike it down, and some, like in Hawaii, like Hawaii striking down the Muslim ban,
nationwide injunctions.
Yeah, what in the world? So then you get to 2020. They feel like they've got it in the bag because they can just hit COVID over and over and over again. Election's still close, Yeah. In 2020, so they go, okay, so this maximum pressure campaign against Trump, right? Talking about him 24/7 isn't working. What are we going to do after January 6th? We're going to basically impose a complete media blackout.
Censorship.
That's
what the strategy went from showing images of an empty lectern waiting for Trump to arrive on stage, which is what they did in 2016, to constant protestations that any word Trump had uttered which would appear on their air. So remember, during his presidency, you'd get apologies from people like Rachel Maddow. I'm sorry, you shouldn't have seen that unfiltered. It's our responsibility to prevent that from just going out over the airwaves. We need to spend some time looking at this first before we decide to show you a clip. And when we do show you a clip, we have some fact checks we'd like to introduce. We want to make sure that people have the proper understanding of what Trump is saying and what to make of it. That's the mode that they went with. And then after January 6th, it went full-blown blackout. Like, we've got to stop people from even knowing he's alive. Like, we've got to, this has got to end. So, but their instincts were not to enhance the conversation. It was to limit it to stifle it as much as possible.
And it was interesting to see Trump's banned from social media, no Trump rallies airing anywhere.
Yeah.
There's no clips played. Trump's still basically on the campaign trail at the time. He's like, oh, I'm not going to announce that I'm running for president. Everyone knew he was going to run in 2024. Complete blackout. During that period of time, I don't think it's any surprise that Donald Trump's approval rating goes up immensely. So all of a sudden, they're faced with an unpopular president in Joe Biden and an even more popular President Trump after the blackout, and these guys are going head-to-head in 2024. we need to revert back to the old strategy with some adjustments.
Yes.
So so we're going to cover Trump wall to wall, but we're going to lean heavily on selective edits, as they suggested previously, right? We're going to selectively edit things. We're going to constantly fact check, and you can kind of see they want to take a step back in a way because they think that Trump can just talk himself into the ground with, the dogs and cats and all this stuff, which Chris Rufo has a video of someone cooking a cat in Dayton, which is the municipality next to Springfield. I just want to put that out there. But they think he'll talk himself into oblivion.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, there's a very human element that comes out in the media because they've been doing this for 8 years and they can't figure out how to kill this guy. Figuratively, not literally. They're trying to do that too. But they can't figure that out. And so there's a human element that comes in where David Muir can't help himself. He needs to fact check, right?
Yeah, incorrectly.
So incorrectly. But if you're David Muir sitting there, your goal is to just try to take a step back and let Trump talk himself into the ground, and that they kept interjecting. Do you think that's the case? I mean, how is the media handling Trump this time around? Because
what you're talking about,
I'm trying to find consistency there, but
the
there
subtext
isn't.
to what you and I are both discussing is that their interest is not actually about their ratings or delivering information.
Yeah,
their interest now is entirely political. It's entirely how do we stop this guy, and everything we're trying isn't working. We show him a lot on television, he becomes more popular. We stop him from appearing on television, he becomes more popular. He's the most frustrating political figure to the establishment who has ever existed in our country, ever, because they don't actually know how to stop him. The lawfare we've seen, which is so transparently phony. The efforts to say, oh, he's a criminal. Look at all these indictments that we brought against him. What does that mean? I don't trust you. Why would I trust your indictments? And those indictments were all dropped in the year of the election. And related to, you say, behavior that occurred either many years ago or prior to the last one. What? What are you talking about? And it's just, there's a constant effort to destroy him. And those efforts, because he fights, have only endeared more people to him. So especially during the New York trial, where he would step out every day and do a quick statement to the press in the morning and the evening. No questions. He would just give a statement about what was happening in the courtroom, the unconstitutional gag order that was imposed on him, and the efforts to upend his campaign. He would talk about it. His support was rising throughout all of that, throughout all of it. MSNBC, I guarantee, was convinced at the outset, oh, this is great. He's in a courtroom. He's in trial. People are going to think of him as a criminal. It's going to hurt him. Yeah, we'll get the cameras on him. They got the cameras on him again. It only helped him. Help. He's a deeply frustrating figure in American politics. And the reason for that is because, by and large, he doesn't play their game. He has no interest in their game. He calls out their game, and then he circumvents their game. And it drives them absolutely crazy. So you're right. The media did play a role in 2016 in featuring him on a lot. And his fights with some of those media figures redounded to his benefit in a huge way. But also, Trump went on social media. Trump was like, I'm just going to talk directly to people. I don't need to be filtered and manipulated and handled by these disgusting people. I'm not going to do that. And when I do go in there with them and I do combat, people like it too. So,
Well, and that gets to the precision strikes that you mentioned, right? By rejecting the premise of their game entirely. What he's done is he's forced them, it seems, into a scenario where we can't care about ratings anymore. Our motivations are overtly political.
Look, David Muir lost, I think 14% of his audience after he did that debate.
Right.
So that was his decision to lie on national television about crime statistics, interposing himself in that debate, had the effect of crushing a massive percentage of his audience. So because people were like, how could I trust this guy? First of all, you teamed up against only one candidate on stage. And when you did, you lied. So what?
For my entire life, since I can remember, ABC World News was on every single night in my mother's household. After that debate, it has not been on one single time.
Really?
Yes. My grandmother, who is the one, my mom's like, I'd rather watch something else at this point. I see the media for what it actually is. But my grandmother, who's up there in years, just loves her routine. She would always turn it on. She watched that debate. She said, this is disgusting, and it hasn't been on since in my house. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And when you see that, right, when the media is finally exposed to be just the political machine that it is, well, now it's those precision strikes that encourage that type of decentralization in media that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
That they turn to no more. They're not turning to legacy media anymore. They're turning to social media. They're turning to Joe Rogan. They're turning to Tucker's new show. So are we seeing a decentralization of the media environment?
Big time, 100%. And that's one of the reasons that the media are put in these impossible financial situations. Is the reason you keep seeing these stories of massive layoffs at these legacy media companies. That's exactly right. Their business model's falling apart because people don't trust them and they don't turn to them. And if you're an ad buyer, which is what these media companies are largely funded by, you're saying, well, why am I going to put advertising on a platform that doesn't have any eyeballs? Like, that doesn't make any sense for my product. Or why would I pay those rates if I'm not getting that many viewers? So that's where the business side of things begins to slam into them. And it's a real tragedy what's happened to the legacy press and traditional journalism. It's a huge tragedy because the founders were really intentional about trying to insulate it from threats. They wanted it in the First Amendment for a reason. It was designed to scrutinize the powerful, but instead it's become a really obvious handmaiden of power, a cartoonish one, and people are rejecting it. So I guess what happens next is, what are the threats to the places that tell you the truth?
This is exactly my next question, right? Now, this decentralized media environment relies on what? Typically big tech platforms, right?
Yeah.
That are incredibly centralized. So what are those threats?
The threats are what Hillary Clinton's vision of regulating what's allowed to be expressed on social media. The threats are, conservatives have had a really kind of bizarre relationship with Section 203 of the Communications Decency Act, which is like, we're watching these tech companies abuse their power to censor the town square. And so a lot of us have asked, well, why do we give you immunity from liability? Why does the taxpayer give you this immense privilege? But the reality here is it's more complicated than, like I said, Thomas Sowell. It's about trade-offs. Here's the problem. You get rid of Section 203, they're going to shut down all speech on these platforms because they don't want the litigation. I'm sorry, if I'm not being specific enough, basically these tech companies are insulated from lawsuits for things that you and I might express on their platforms. So they can't be sued, which makes sense. Like,
to a certain degree, there's 6 million Twitter users, right? How is somebody?
It's not the phone company's fault that I called in a bomb threat. That's not. It's my fault. I did that, so I should be held accountable for it. But and the same thinking should go to social media. The problem is, we're like, wait a second, we're affording you these immense privileges, and yet you are editorially manipulating your algorithms for your preferred political party. So why should we keep giving you this privilege? That was where the conversation was. Now that we have people like Elon Musk in our corner, when I say in our corner, those who like free speech, which is great, you can see things changing a bit. Because if Hillary Clinton gets her way, she removes Section 230 immunity and she shuts down Twitter. Twitter will become crushed under the weight of the lawsuits because now Twitter owns every harebrained thing that's expressed on the platform. Anything that you can plausibly say is defamatory or libelous, they'll go after, and it will crush Twitter as an organization. And the whole point of that will not be fighting it out over who slandered whom or anything like that. It's really about stopping a means of communication that's outside of the control of the establishment. So, Elon Musk is a great example of someone, ruling class guy, one of the richest people in the world, at least the documented ones. It's a little harder to tell with like Vladimir Putin or some of the Mideast oil barons. But, he's a guy who was beloved by the left. Beloved. He's the EV guy. He's the electric vehicles. He's Tesla. He's this big thinker. He's on our side. He supports electric cars. Like, yeah, we got a billionaire on a corner. And then he comes along and he's like, hey, you guys are threatening free speech too much. I don't like that. And they turned on him. Knives came out. Every lawsuit they could possibly throw at him, regulatory bodies going after him, the FCC trying to take him down, just constant barrage of attacks, foreclosing on government contracts, being awarded to other contractors, even though some of his companies would be better positioned and better priced for the American people. And this is all, it's all just partisanship. It's all being animated by politics. So I'd say that, look, in the spaces where Americans are freely communicating, we all have to be on guard that that's not going to be that way forever if the left gets its way. They want to stop you from that. They do not want these open conversations. And Americans have the right, first and foremost, to freely express themselves. That's in the First Amendment. They also have the right to be wrong. They also have the right to lie to each other. There are ways we handle that in the country. Like if you defraud someone, you've run afoul of important laws. But like the idea that they need to interject and like stop your conversations or control what you're saying or not allow you to talk about where COVID maybe came from. Oh, that lab, Wuhan. Like you're not allowed to talk about that. That was that way for a while. That they have an insatiable appetite to do more of that. And it's not just at the U.S. level, it's at the global level. That's what the World Economic Forum talks about.
The guy who founded Telegram is in a cell right now.
Yes.
There's a reason for that. And there's also a reason
for views that other people expressed on his platform, not for his own views.
Yes. And to bring this back to the media, no surprise then that the media is the cheerleader. The legacy media, the corporate media is the cheerleader for these types of censorship efforts because it destroys their competitor.
It's a protection racket.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. It's like the last thing we need is people turning away from us. We need them to stay with us. And rather than create a better product, we will crush the means you have to get away from us.
So do you think the legacy media will feel vindicated if Kamala Harris wins in 2024?
I think they'll feel elated. Vindicated? How do you mean vindicated?
Will they feel justified in the actions that they've undertaken?
Oh, I see. In order to get her across the finish line. Well, yeah, because then they'll be like, hey, yeah, mission accomplished. Well, yeah, no, that's true. Yeah,
it could kill. Will it kill them in the process? Like at what cost for the media, right?
I mean,
are they already dead?
The left is so paralyzed by so much short-term thinking that sometimes I think that they're not even contemplating it. It's like how they handled Trump in the first place. But you're right to point this out because when we talk about election rigging, what better way to rig an election than to rig someone's mind? What better way? If you can control the minds of the people who pull the levers, you've rigged the election, baby. That's it. And the media has attempted this over and over and over with mixed results, for sure. I mean, the whole Kamala Harris candidacy is really a test of the media's ability to rig the election. It's like, how much of an empty vessel could we possibly get elected president of the United States? Let's see, how much power do we have? Is it possible to take the least eloquent politician who's ever existed, to include Joe Biden, who's ever existed, and get her into the Oval Office? Do we have the power to do that still? And so that's what this election is.
So as they test their power, what are the things that people should look out for? What type of hoaxes do you think the media will perpetrate as we near this election?
Well, one of the upsides of having so many hoaxes that we've already been through is that people are so attuned to sniffing out bullcrap that when they see a story now, the half-life on it as a Trump scandal or something is so non-existent. It disappears in maybe 30 seconds. Like you're like, whoa, that's wait a second. Oh no, he never did that. Or they'll be like, I gotta watch the whole video. I gotta see the clip. Let me go see the clip. And then they see the clip and they're like, he wasn't saying immigrants are animals. He said MS-13 are animals. You know what I mean? Like, so how many times do we have to go through this experience before you learn from it? Unfortunately, there's I have a colleague at WMAL, Dan Bongino, and he often points out is like, is it bad enough yet? Is his expression. It's like basically the core question is it bad enough yet? To wake up enough people that they pull the lever for liberty, that they pull the lever to get out of this crazy status quo. And I don't know the answer to that just yet. I do feel like this election is an IQ test. Like if you're still falling for it at this point, you're below room temperature. like this is not, things are not looking good for you right now. And you shouldn't fall for it anymore.
Vince, thank you.
Thanks
for coming
for
on the
having
Signal Sitdown.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.